The sound of steel rasping against steel filled the dim workshop like a prayer whispered in the wrong language. Louis Chauchat's hands, stained with machine oil and ink from blueprint corrections, held a crescent-shaped magazine that caught the pale December light filtering through the frost-glazed windows. Outside, on the cobblestone streets of Saint-Étienne, horse-drawn carts carried wooden crates eastward toward the front. Inside, in the workshop that smelled of gun oil, coal smoke, and the particular metallic tang of fresh-cut steel, Chauchat turned the peculiar curved magazine over in his palms, feeling its weight. "It looks wrong," Charles Sutter said quietly from across the workbench, not meeting Chauchat's eyes. "The officers will laugh at us." "Let them laugh," Chauchat replied, his voice carrying the flat exhaustion of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. "The men dying at Verdun don't have time for weapons that look right. It was the morning of December 12th, 1915, and France was bleeding to death one trench at a time. The reports arrived with brutal regularity. Another company shattered advancing across open ground, another battalion pinned down by German machine gun fire they could not suppress, could not flank, could not survive. The mathematics were unbearable. One Maxim gun, mounted on a tripod, fed by cloth belts, operated by 3 men in a reinforced position, could kill an entire French assault before it reached the wire. The Liebel rifle, elegant, accurate, beloved by traditionalists, fired 8 rounds before requiring a reload that took precious seconds a dying man did not have. The French High Command had demanded a solution, something portable enough for infantry to carry into assault, automatic enough to suppress enemy positions, cheap enough to produce by the tens of thousands. What they wanted, Chauchat understood, was a miracle that looked like a Maxim gun, but weighed nothing and cost centimes. What they would accept, he feared, was nothing at all, because what he and Sutter had created looked like improvisation wrapped in desperation. The prototype sat on the workbench between them, components laid out with the careful precision of surgeons preparing an operation. The long recoil system, the simple stamped parts, the magazine that curved like a smile because the 8-minute Liebel cartridge France, already produced in massive quantities, was too long for a straight feed. Every choice had been made with the same ruthless logic: simplicity over sophistication, availability over perfection, now over eventually. "The first trials are tomorrow," Sutter said, and Chauchat heard the question his partner would not speak aloud. "I know." What Chauchat did not say, what he carried in the silence that followed, was the weight of his brother's last letter. 3 sentences, written in a trench near Champagne 2 weeks before a shell ended the correspondence permanently. "They cut us down before we could reach their wire. We had rifles. They had machine guns. Tell me why we're supposed to win with courage alone." The workshop grew colder as afternoon faded. Chauchat assembled the weapon with movements that had become ritual: barrel housing, bolt mechanism, return spring, the curved magazine that slid into place with a soft metallic click that sounded to his ears like a promise he was not certain he could keep. When he lifted it, the weapon felt insubstantial, just 9 kilograms, light enough for one man to carry and operate alone. It rattled slightly when he shifted his grip. The open-sided magazine showed the cartridges stacked inside like brass teeth. "If this fails," Sutter began. "If this fails," Chauchat interrupted, "we try again. If we stop, soldiers keep dying with rifles in their hands, wondering why courage isn't enough." He did not add what both men knew, that if the weapon failed spectacularly, if it embarrassed the procurement officers who had reluctantly authorized these trials, if it proved to be one more workshop dream that collapsed under battlefield reality, their reputations would not survive the laughter. Saint-Étienne's gun workshops operated on tradition, precision, the kind of engineering excellence that took months to perfect and decades to master. What Chauchat and Sutter had built in frantic weeks looked nothing like that tradition. The door opened, bringing cold air and the smell of snow. An officer from the Trials Commission stepped inside, his uniform immaculate, his expression suggesting he had better places to be than a civilian workshop that reeked of improvisation. "Tomorrow morning," he said without preamble, "proving grounds outside Paris. Bring your invention. The committee will give it 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Chauchat repeated. 20 minutes to prove it works better than a Hotchkiss, a Maxim, or any of the other 12 automatic rifle designs currently under evaluation." The officer's gaze traveled across the workshop. The scattered parts, the blueprint corrections pinned to the wall, the weapon that looked too light to matter. "Do you understand what you're claiming? That two watchmakers with a workshop in Saint-Étienne have solved what trained military engineers across France have failed to accomplish?" Chauchat held the man's gaze. Outside, another cart passed, carrying more coffins home from the front. "I understand that men are dying," Chauchat said quietly, "because doctrine values perfection over presence. I understand that the weapon that exists matters more than the weapon that might someday be perfect. And I understand that tomorrow morning you'll see whether simplicity can win when sophistication has failed." The officer left without another word. In the silence that followed, Sutter began wrapping the prototype components in oiled cloth, preparing them for transport. Chauchat stood at the window, watching snow begin to fall on the cobblestones, thinking about his brother's grave in Champagne and the impossible mathematics of courage versus firepower. 20 minutes to change the war, or 20 minutes to prove that some problems could not be solved by men who chose necessity over perfection. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments and stay with us for the next chapters. The proving grounds north of Paris occupied a stretch of frozen mud and wooden targets that had witnessed a decade of ordnance testing. Chauchat arrived before dawn, the prototype wrapped in canvas, his breath visible in the December cold. Sutter carried the ammunition crates, 20 magazines, each loaded with 30 rounds of 8mm Liebel, each one hand-assembled the night before, because the curved shape meant existing loading equipment would not work. The trials committee arrived with the punctuality of men who had schedules to keep and budgets to protect. 7 officers, 3 civilian procurement specialists, 2 representatives from established armories, all gathered around tables set beneath canvas awnings that snapped in the winter wind. Chauchat recognized the dynamic immediately. These were men tasked with selecting France's next infantry automatic weapon from among dozens of competitors, and they had already decided what success should look like. Heavy, substantial, built by known manufacturers with proven track records. What he unwrapped from the canvas looked like none of those things. "Gentlemen," Chauchat began, "this is the CSRG automatic rifle, designed for portable suppressive fire at squad level. 9 kilograms. One of the procurement specialists interrupted, reading from the specification sheet Chauchat had submitted weeks earlier. "That's lighter than a Hotchkiss by nearly half. How does it maintain structural integrity during sustained fire?" "By using fewer parts that can fail," Chauchat replied. "The long recoil system is mechanically simple. The stamped construction—" "Stamped," another officer repeated, the word carrying the weight of professional skepticism. "The Maxim uses precision-machined components. You're proposing we equip French infantry with stamped metal?" Sutter stepped forward, his voice calm. "We're proposing we equip them with a weapon they can actually carry into assault. A Maxim weighs 23 kilograms without the tripod. This weighs 9. A soldier can operate this alone while his squad advances." The committee exchanged glances. Chauchat knew what they saw. 2 civilians from Saint-Étienne, neither with military engineering credentials, from prestigious institutions, claiming to have solved a problem that had consumed the efforts of France's finest designers. The mathematics of credibility were as unforgiving as the mathematics of firepower. "The magazine," one of the armory representatives said, pointing at the crescent shape. "Why that design? It looks fragile." The 8mm Lebel cartridge is rimmed and tapered, Chauchat explained, feeling the familiar weight of having to justify decisions made for sound technical reasons. A straight magazine won't reliably feed it. This curve follows the cartridge geometry, and it's not fragile. It's thin-walled to save weight, but the steel gauge is sufficient for... Sufficient, the procurement specialist interrupted again. Not optimal. Sufficient. The first test began at 0700 hours, with morning light breaking grey and cold across the frozen range. Chauchat loaded the first magazine himself, feeling the cartridges seat properly, hearing the soft clicks as they stacked in the curve. He chambered the first round, settled the buttstock against his shoulder, and pressed the trigger. The weapon fired, not smoothly, not quietly. The long recoil system produced a distinctive mechanical rhythm, a stuttering roar that sounded nothing like the smooth cycle of a Maxim. But it fired. Magazine after magazine, sustained bursts. The spent casings arced through the cold air and landed in the mud with soft metallic whispers. Downrange wooden targets splintered under impacts. When Chauchat lowered the weapon after the fifth magazine, his shoulder aching from recoil, his ears ringing despite the cotton wadding, he turned to face the committee. Several officers were writing notes. The procurement specialists were conferring in low voices. The armory representatives looked unimpressed. "It works," Sutter said quietly, standing beside Chauchat. "It works messily," one of the officers replied, not looking up from his notes. "The recoil stroke is excessive. The rate of fire is slower than a Hotchkiss, and that magazine design will be a maintenance nightmare in field conditions." "Field conditions," Chauchat said, his voice harder than he intended, "are trenches filled with mud where soldiers currently die because they can't suppress enemy positions. This weapon gives them that capability. It's not perfect, but it exists. It can be manufactured now, with existing machinery by semi-skilled workers, in quantities that matter." The senior procurement official stood, buttoning his coat against the cold. "Monsieur Chauchat, France has a tradition of excellence in firearms manufacturing. Saint-Étienne, Châtellerault. Our armories produce weapons of precision and reliability. What you've demonstrated this morning is functional, but functionality achieved through shortcuts in design and manufacturing is not what the French army requires." "What does the French army require?" Sutter asked, and Chauchat heard the edge in his partner's voice. "More time? More perfection? More months while soldiers die with rifles that can't answer machine gun fire?" The committee packed their materials in silence. Before leaving, the senior official paused. "We will submit our findings to the Procurement Directorate. You'll receive formal notification within 6 weeks. I would not, however, recommend you begin planning production." They left Chauchat and Sutter standing in the cold beside a workbench covered in spent brass casings and mud. The prototype sat where Chauchat had placed it, still warm from firing, the distinctive crescent magazine catching the weak winter sunlight. 6 weeks, Sutter said. Chauchat was thinking about something else, about growing up in Saint-Étienne, watching his father repair watches with hands that never quite earned enough to keep the family warm in winter. About the day he discovered he had inherited those same hands, but refused to accept that precision meant poverty. About his brother's letters from the front, each one shorter than the last, each one describing the helplessness of advancing under fire with a rifle that required 8 seconds to reload. About the night he received the telegram that ended those letters permanently. "They want perfection," Chauchat said quietly. "The men in the trenches want something that fires. We gave them something that fires. Now we wait to see which need matters more." The snow began falling again as they packed the prototype back into its canvas wrapping, covering the proving grounds in white that would be gone by afternoon, leaving only mud and the memory of a test that had worked exactly as designed but failed to convince anyone who mattered. The rejection letter arrived on January 18th, 1916, typewritten on official letterhead, 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic courtesy that concluded France would be pursuing other automatic rifle designs, more consistent with established manufacturing standards and doctrinal requirements. Chauchat read it twice in the cold morning light of his workshop, then placed it on the workbench beside the blueprint corrections he had been drafting since the trials. Sutter found him there 2 hours later, still staring at the letter. "They said no," Sutter observed. "Not a question." "They said no," Chauchat confirmed. He picked up the letter, read the closing paragraph again. "While the committee acknowledges the functional demonstration of your prototype, concerns regarding manufacturing quality, field maintenance requirements, and long-term reliability preclude recommendation for procurement at this time. So it's over." Chauchat set the letter down carefully. "The letter is dated 3 days ago. Do you know what happened 2 days ago?" Sutter shook his head. "Verdun," Chauchat said quietly. "The Germans began shelling Verdun 2 days ago. The reports are calling it the largest artillery bombardment in history, and the French positions that survive the shelling will face German infantry supported by machine gun teams that our soldiers still can't suppress effectively." The workshop fell silent, except for the distant sound of a train whistle. More soldiers heading east, more families waiting for telegrams, more coffins that would eventually return to platforms decorated with flags that meant nothing to the dead. "We could appeal," Sutter suggested without conviction. "To whom?" Chauchat asked. "The same committee that watched it work and decided functionality wasn't enough? The procurement directorate that values tradition over results? The generals who will send another wave of men across no man's land with Liebel rifles and expect courage to outweigh firepower?" He stood, walked to the window, watched snow falling on Saint-Étienne's streets. Somewhere in this city, in workshops built on a century of gun-making excellence, other designers were crafting elegant solutions to the automatic rifle problem. Solutions with precision-machined components, solutions that would take months to perfect and years to manufacture in meaningful quantities, solutions that would arrive too late for the men currently dying because doctrine moved slower than artillery shells. "My father used to say that a watch repaired properly was worth waiting for," Chauchat said, still watching the snow. He would spend hours on a single mechanism, getting every jewel seated perfectly, every gear meshed with absolute precision. And he was right, for watches, but war doesn't wait for perfect mechanisms. Sutter joined him at the window. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the number 240, Chauchat replied. "That's the rate of fire our prototype demonstrated. Rounds per minute. Not as fast as a Maxim, not as slow as a rifle, fast enough to suppress, fast enough to give infantry a chance. And I'm thinking about the number 250,000. 250,000. What? The number of automatic rifles France would need to give every infantry section suppressive fire capability," Chauchat said. "At current production rates for precision-machined weapons, that would take 3 years. Our design, with stamped parts and simplified manufacturing, could reach that number in 18 months, maybe less. If anyone would manufacture it," Sutter pointed out. If anyone believed the numbers mattered more than the aesthetics, Chauchat agreed. A knock interrupted them. Chauchat turned to find a young officer standing in the workshop doorway, uniform muddy, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man recently returned from the front. The officer held a folded paper. "Monsieur Chauchat, I was told to deliver this directly. It's from Captain Mercier, 3rd Division Artillery." Chauchat unfolded the paper. It was a field report, written in pencil on standard military forms, dated 5 days earlier. The handwriting was hurried but precise. "Observe German infantry advance, supported by MG-08 teams. Our section attempted to provide covering fire with Liebel rifles, insufficient volume. Lost 8 men in the first minute. Cannot continue to send soldiers into this equation with tools designed for a different war. Whatever happened to that automatic rifle the Saint-Étienne designers demonstrated? We need it. We needed it yesterday. We need it before more mathematics written in blood prove what we already know. The officer spoke quietly. Captain Mercier asked me to tell you that the procurement committee's letter doesn't change the reality in the trenches. He said you'd understand. After the officer left, Chauchat handed the field report to Sutter, then walked back to the workbench where the rejection letter still lay beside the blueprint corrections. He picked up both documents, held them side by side in the pale winter light. One told him his weapon wasn't good enough for France's standards. The other told him it was desperately needed despite those standards. "Charles," he said, "how many machine shops in Saint-Étienne do you think would help us manufacture components if we paid them directly, without official procurement approval?" Sutter's voice carried doubt and something else, possibly hope. "That would be irregular." "So is dying with a rifle when you need suppressive fire," Chauchat replied. The committee said no to official procurement. They didn't say we couldn't continue private development. They didn't say field units couldn't request experimental weapons for trial, and they certainly didn't say that reality was forbidden from contradicting doctrine. Over the next 2 weeks, working in a workshop that grew colder as winter deepened, Chauchat and Sutter began a different kind of campaign. Not through official channels, not through procurement committees that valued aesthetics over mathematics. Through networks of workshops, through field officers who wrote reports no one wanted to read, through the simple arithmetic that said suppressive fire mattered more than perfect machining. They modified the prototype, strengthened the magazine feed lips, adjusted the recoil spring tension, tested it in mud, in snow, in conditions that would never appear in official proving grounds, but defined every hour of trench warfare. Each modification was documented, each test result recorded, each improvement noted in reports sent to field units that had requested experimental weapons. The breakthrough came not as approval, but as acknowledgement. A procurement notice posted in February requesting proposals for simplified automatic rifle designs capable of rapid field production. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to preserve the fiction that the committee had always valued practicality. But buried in the specifications, weight limits that matched the CSRG prototype, rate of fire requirements that matched their test results, manufacturing constraints that match their stamped component approach. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. The telegram arrived at 0430 hours on March 7, 1916. Urgent trials authorized. Stop, bring 3 functional prototypes. Paris Depot. March 10th. Stop, prepare for field evaluation, frontline conditions. Stop, Mercier. Chauchat read it 3 times before waking Sutter, who was sleeping on a cot in the corner of the workshop where he had been spending most nights since they began the modified production run. They had 4 days to prepare 3 weapons that would be tested not in the controlled environment of a proving ground, but in actual combat conditions somewhere along the Western Front. "We have 2 complete prototypes," Sutter said, instantly awake. "The third is missing the barrel housing assembly." "Then we have 4 days to complete it," Chauchat replied, already moving toward the workbench where components lay organized in careful rows. "We also have 4 days to prepare documentation that proves every modification we made improved reliability without compromising the core design." What he did not say, what both men understood, was that this was not another committee evaluation. This was the test that mattered. Soldiers who needed suppressive fire would determine whether the CSRG worked, not officers who needed weapons that matched pre-war expectations. They worked without stopping. Sutter managed the final machining operations, adjusting tolerances on the 3rd barrel housing until it mated perfectly with the receiver. Chauchat assembled detailed maintenance instructions, stripped down to the essential operations a soldier could perform in a trench with cold fingers and limited light. They test-fired each weapon 200 rounds, made adjustments, tested again. The workshop filled with the smell of gun oil and burnt powder, and the particular tension of knowing that every decision now carried the weight of lives they would never meet. On the morning of March 9th, an unexpected visitor arrived, one of the procurement specialists from the original trials committee, a man named Delacroix, whom Chauchat remembered for his skeptical questions about stamped construction. "Monsieur Chauchat," Delacroix said, standing in the workshop doorway with an expression that mixed discomfort with something that might have been respect. "I heard about the field trials authorization. You came to observe the preparations?" Chauchat asked, not hostile but cautious. "I came to apologize," Delacroix replied quietly. He stepped inside, closed the door against the March wind, "and to help, if you'll allow it." The admission hung in the air between them. Sutter stopped working on the third prototype, waiting. The committee's decision was based on legitimate concerns, Delacroix continued. "Manufacturing standards exist for reasons. Quality control matters, but I've been reading the field reports from Verdun, the casualty numbers, the tactical assessments from company commanders who watched their men die because they couldn't suppress German machine gun positions." He paused. "I was wrong to prioritize perfection over presence." Chauchat gestured to the workbench covered in components. "What kind of help did you have in mind?" "I have access to the military logistics network," Delacroix said. "I can ensure your prototypes and ammunition reach the designated test unit without bureaucratic delays. I can also ensure the field reports from the trials reach decision-makers who actually read them." He met Chauchat's gaze. "I can't guarantee they'll approve production, but I can guarantee they won't be able to ignore the results." Over the next 24 hours, Delacroix proved as capable at navigating military logistics as he had been at questioning design specifications. Transportation was arranged, ammunition shipments coordinated, field test protocols established that would measure not aesthetic qualities, but tactical effectiveness. Rounds fired before failure, suppression capability under combat stress, reliability in mud and cold, ease of maintenance under frontline conditions. The night before departure, Chauchat found himself alone in the workshop with the 3 completed weapons laid out on the workbench. 9 kilograms each, distinctive crescent magazines, the mechanical simplicity that had earned them rejection and might now earn them vindication. He picked up the first one, felt its weight, remembered his brother's last letter about courage versus firepower. "You're thinking about him," Sutter said from the doorway. "I'm thinking about all of them," Chauchat replied. "Every soldier who died advancing with a rifle against machine guns, every family that received telegrams, every field commander who wrote reports explaining that courage wasn't enough when the mathematics favored the defender." He set the weapon down carefully. "This doesn't bring any of them back. Even if it works perfectly, even if it saves thousands of lives, it doesn't undo the deaths that happened while committees debated manufacturing standards." "No," Sutter agreed, "but it might prevent the next 1,000 deaths. Isn't that enough?" Chauchat didn't answer immediately. Outside, the last train of the evening passed through Saint-Étienne, carrying soldiers toward the front, carrying them toward trenches where German machine guns waited with the patient mathematics of overlapping fields of fire, carrying them toward moments where 9 kilograms of stamped steel and simplified mechanics might be the difference between suppression and slaughter. "It has to be enough," he said finally, "because it's all we have to offer." They departed for Paris at dawn, 3 weapons packed in wooden crates, labeled with military designations that transformed workshop prototypes into official experimental ordnance. Delacroix had arranged transportation to a depot north of the city, where Captain Mercier's unit, recently rotated back from Verdun for rest and refit, would conduct the field evaluation. The unit's bivouac area occupied a muddy field behind the lines, close enough to the front that artillery rumbled like distant thunder. Chauchat and Sutter arrived to find Mercier waiting beside a tent that served as the company command post. The captain looked older than his file suggested, aged by whatever he had witnessed during the Verdun fighting. The weapons that work on proving grounds, Mercier said without preamble, often fail in trenches. The weapons that impress committees often disappoint soldiers. Which category does yours fall into? We're here to find out, Chauchat replied. Mercier nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, my best section conducts a trench raid on a German observation post. They'll carry your weapons. If they work, I'll write a report that makes the procurement committee look like fools. If they fail, I'll write a report that ensures you never submit another design. Fair? Fair, Chauchat agreed, knowing it was the only honest evaluation that mattered. That night, he could not sleep. He lay in a tent, listening to distant artillery and thinking about the equation he had been trying to solve since his brother's death. The balance between perfection and necessity, between what doctrine demanded and what reality required. Tomorrow would provide an answer. Not in committee notes or procurement letters, but in whether soldiers returned from a raid alive because they had been able to suppress enemy positions. The mathematics of war were about to render their verdict. The section departed the forward trench at 04:45 hours, 12 men moving through pre-dawn darkness toward a German observation post 600 meters into no man's land. 3 carried CSRG prototypes, 9 carried Liebel rifles and grenades. All carried the particular tension of men who understood that the next hour would be written in violence or silence, with no middle ground between. Chauchat watched from the company command post, a reinforced dugout 200 meters behind the front line. Beside him, Captain Mercier studied a map by candlelight, tracking the section's expected route through areas where artillery had created enough crater cover for approach. Sutter stood near the dugout entrance, listening to the night sounds of the front, distant rifle fire, the occasional crack of a star shell bursting overhead, the low conversation of soldiers on watch. "They'll hit the post at first light," Mercier said quietly. "German sentries are most alert during darkness. Dawn creates a brief window when exhaustion and changing light make observation difficult." "And if the weapons fail?" Chauchat asked. "Then my men attempt to suppress the post with Liebel rifles while under fire from German machine guns. And we lose soldiers, proving what we already know. That courage doesn't outweigh firepower." Mercier looked up from the map. "Your weapons don't need to be perfect, Monsieur Chauchat. They need to give my men a chance." The first shots came at 05:02 hours, the sharp crack of rifle fire, then the distinctive stutter of automatic weapons. Not the smooth mechanical rhythm of a Maxim, but something irregular, aggressive, the sound of the CSRG prototypes firing in short, controlled bursts. Chauchat moved to the dugout entrance, straining to identify individual sounds in the cacophony. More rifle fire, grenades, then silence that stretched for seconds that felt like hours. A runner arrived at 05:20 hours, breathless from sprinting through the communication trenches. "Captain, the section is returning. No casualties." "The observation post is destroyed." Mercier and Chauchat reached the forward trench as the section climbed back over the parapet, mud-covered and exhausted but intact. The sergeant in charge, a veteran named Girard, carried one of the CSRG weapons. The barrel housing was spattered with mud. The distinctive crescent magazine showed scratches and dents. But when Girard set it down on the firing step, he did so with something approaching reverence. "Report," Mercier ordered. Girard pulled a notebook from his pocket, flipped to notes written in pencil. "We approached the post from the northwest, using crater cover. German sentries detected us at approximately 04:55 hours, initiated rifle fire. We returned fire with the automatic weapons at 70 meters range. The suppressive effect was immediate and decisive." "Explain decisive," Mercier said. "The Germans stopped shooting back, sir," Girard replied simply. "The volume of fire from 3 of these weapons kept them pinned, while the rifle team advanced and cleared the post with grenades. Estimated enemy casualties, 4 confirmed, 2 probable. Our casualties, none." He paused. We fired approximately 600 rounds total across all three weapons. 2 minor stoppages, both cleared immediately with standard malfunction drills. The weapons functioned in mud, in darkness, in combat stress conditions. They worked. Chauchat felt something shift in his chest, a release of tension he had been carrying for months without acknowledging its weight. Sutter, standing beside him, exhaled slowly. "The stoppages?" Mercier asked. "Describe them." "Magazine feed issues," Girard said. "Brief. One required tapping the magazine to reseat it. The other required cycling the action once. Neither stoppage exceeded 5 seconds or compromised suppressive fire." He looked directly at Chauchat. "Sir, I've been fighting on the Western Front for 18 months. I've participated in 17 raids. This is the first time my section completed an assault on a fortified position without taking casualties. These weapons gave us something we've never had, the ability to make the enemy keep their heads down while we closed the distance." The after-action report Mercier filed that morning contained technical observations, ammunition expenditure data, and tactical recommendations. But the conclusion was written in language that left no room for bureaucratic evasion. The CSRG automatic rifle demonstrated decisive tactical utility under combat conditions, recon immediate procurement, and field distribution to all infantry sections. Within 48 hours, the report reached the Procurement Directorate. Within a week, orders were issued for initial production of 10,000 units. By mid-April, manufacturing had begun across multiple Saint-Étienne workshops with simplified production protocols that allowed semi-skilled workers to produce components that precision craftsmen had insisted required months of training. The transformation happened with bureaucratic speed that would have been impossible without Captain Mercier's report, but it happened. By summer 1916, CSRG weapons were arriving at frontline units in wooden crates that smelled of gun oil and fresh paint. Soldiers who received them treated the weapons with the same skepticism the procurement committee had shown, until they fired them in combat and discovered that suppressive fire capability at squad level changed the mathematics of assault. Chauchat received reports from the field. Units that successfully raided German trenches, squads that broke up counterattacks, sections that finally had tools that matched their tactical requirements. Each report contained technical feedback, magazine reliability issues in wet conditions, feed problems with certain ammunition lots, maintenance challenges under field stress. But even the critical reports acknowledged what Sergeant Girard had proven in that first raid. The weapon worked well enough to matter, and well enough was revolutionary compared to having no squad automatic weapon at all. By autumn, production had reached 50,000 units. By the end of 1916, over 100,000. The numbers climbed with the same inexorable mathematics that had driven Chauchat's initial calculations. France needed automatic firepower at the infantry level, needed it in quantities that precision manufacturing could never deliver quickly enough, needed it despite the aesthetic objections of traditionalists who valued elegance over effectiveness. The weapon's reputation remained mixed. Soldiers complained about the magazine. Officers noted the reliability challenges. But tactical doctrine began shifting around the capability the CSRG provided. Infantry sections learned to advance under their own covering fire, to suppress enemy positions during assault, to fight with tools that matched modern warfare's demands rather than pre-war assumptions. In his Saint-Étienne workshop, surrounded by production reports and field feedback, Chauchat understood that he had created something more complicated than victory. He had proven that necessity could triumph over perfection, that functionality mattered more than aesthetics, that lives could be saved by weapons that worked imperfectly rather than waiting for weapons that might someday achieve perfection. But he had also created a weapon that failed soldiers when magazines jammed at critical moments. Every casualty report that mentioned CSRG malfunctions carried the weight of his design choices. Every criticism of the weapon's reliability reflected compromises he had made in pursuit of rapid production. The mathematics of war demanded difficult equations. Some of them, Chauchat was learning, had no solutions that allowed you to sleep peacefully. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, with church bells ringing across France and soldiers emerging from trenches that had defined their world for 4 years. By then, France had produced over 260,000 CSRG automatic rifles. American forces, arriving without adequate automatic weapons, had received thousands chambered in .30-06 caliber, a hasty modification that suffered worse reliability problems than the French original and would cement the weapon's reputation as the worst machine gun ever made in English-language histories. But in French sectors, where soldiers understood the weapon's limitations and capabilities, the CSRG remained a tool that had given infantry something they desperately needed: portable automatic fire at the point of decision. Louis Chauchat did not attend the victory celebrations. He spent Armistice Day in his Saint-Étienne workshop, now expanded to accommodate ongoing military contracts, surrounded by technical manuals and field modification reports. The war had ended. The weapon that bore his name had changed infantry tactics across multiple armies, but the knowledge of what it had cost, in compromised reliability, in soldiers who trusted a weapon that failed them, in the gap between what he had delivered and what perfection might have achieved, sat heavy in the quiet afternoon light. A letter arrived in December, forwarded through military channels. It came from a veteran of Mercier's company, written in the careful handwriting of someone for whom writing was labor. Monsieur Chauchat, you don't know me. I was in the section that first tested your weapon in that raid back in 1916. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that we called it the knocker because of the noise it made, and we cursed it when magazines jammed, and we complained about its weight and its kick and the way mud got into everything. But I also wanted you to know that I'm alive to write this letter because of that weapon. It gave us fire superiority when we needed it. It kept German heads down when we advanced. It wasn't perfect, but it was there, and it worked enough. And enough mattered when the alternative was crossing open ground with just rifles. I hope you understand what that means. It means you saved lives, mine included. Thank you. Chauchat read the letter 3 times, then placed it in a wooden box where he kept documentation he could not bear to discard: his brother's final letter, Mercier's combat report, the procurement committee's rejection notice, field feedback that ranged from praise to bitter criticism. The box held the truth of what he had accomplished, not perfection, not a weapon that historians would celebrate as a masterpiece of engineering, but something more complicated and more human, a solution that existed when it was needed, that worked imperfectly but worked, that changed tactical doctrine by proving that portable automatic firepower mattered more than aesthetic excellence. Charles Sutter visited in January 1919, finding Chauchat at the workbench where they had first assembled the prototype 4 years earlier. The workshop looked different now, larger, better equipped, filled with contracts for post-war production. But the essential spirit remained unchanged. "The Army wants to know if we'll design a replacement," Sutter said without preamble. "Something that addresses all the field complaints. Better magazines, improved feed system, tighter tolerances." "What did you tell them?" Chauchat asked. "That I was done with weapons design," Sutter replied. "That I couldn't spend another night wondering if choices I made to save time or reduce cost got someone killed when the mechanism jammed." He paused. "What will you say?" Chauchat looked at the workbench, at the tools that had shaped steel into weapons that had shaped history. "I'll say that the CSRG taught everyone who followed what not to do, that every light machine gun developed since studied our failures as carefully as our successes, that we proved portable automatic fire was tactically essential, and the lessons came through imperfection, but they were lessons nonetheless." He stood, walked to the window overlooking Saint-Étienne's streets. Outside, workers returned from factories that were slowly converting from wartime to peacetime production. Veterans in faded uniforms navigated cobblestones they had left years earlier. The world was rebuilding, moving forward, trying to forget the mathematics written in blood. "But will you design the replacement?" Sutter pressed. "No," Chauchat said quietly. "Let someone else create the perfect weapon. Let them have years to refine it, to test it, to eliminate every flaw. Let them build something worthy of France's engineering tradition." He turned from the window. "We built what was necessary when necessity mattered more than perfection. That's enough. It has to be enough." Over the following decades, military historians would debate the CSRG's legacy. Some condemned it as evidence of the dangers of rushed wartime procurement, a cautionary tale about compromising quality for quantity. Others recognized it as proof that tactical innovation often came from imperfect tools that existed rather than perfect tools that remained theoretical. Veterans remembered it with mixed feelings, cursing its jams while acknowledging it had given them capabilities they wouldn't have had otherwise. The weapon itself largely disappeared from service, replaced by designs that learned from its failures. Better magazines, more reliable feed systems, tighter manufacturing tolerances. But the tactical doctrine it helped create, infantry sections with organic automatic fire capability, suppression and maneuver, distributed firepower at the squad level, became the foundation of infantry combat for the next century. Chauchat himself withdrew from military design work, quietly consulting on small arms development, but never again pursuing the kind of rushed innovation that had defined the CSRG's creation. He spoke rarely of the war or the weapon that bore his name. When pressed, he would acknowledge that it had worked well enough, when well enough was all that stood between doctrine and defeat. In 1952, a military historian conducting research on World War I automatic weapons visited Chauchat's Saint-Étienne apartment. The old designer, now in his 70s, spoke carefully about technical decisions made in that frantic winter of 1915 to 16. But when the historian asked what he wanted history to remember, Chauchat's answer was simple. Remember that sometimes the weapon that exists matters more than the weapon that might someday be perfect. Remember that soldiers needed suppressive fire, and we gave them something that provided it, imperfectly but immediately. And remember that the cost of innovation isn't just measured in francs and production hours. It's measured in the knowledge that your design choices, made in desperate urgency, affected whether men lived or died. That burden doesn't disappear when the shooting stops. He died in 1956, largely forgotten outside specialist circles. The weapon that bore his name had become a footnote in military history, remembered more for its failures than its revolutionary impact on infantry tactics. But in museums and archives, in the memories of veterans who had carried it, in the doctrinal manuals that described squad automatic weapons as essential rather than experimental, the legacy persisted, not as triumph, not as tragedy, but as something more honest, the recognition that changing warfare required being right before anyone believed you, that necessity sometimes demanded imperfect solutions, and that the burden of innovation was measured in sleepless nights, wondering if the choices you made in pursuit of speed and simplicity cost lives you would never meet. The weapon that fired imperfectly, when perfection was impossible and necessity was absolute. The designer who dared to answer an impossible demand with an imperfect solution. The lesson, learned through failure, that presence mattered more than perfection when lives hung in the balance. In the end, history remembered not the man, but the knowledge that emerged from his weapon's shortcomings, knowledge that informed every automatic rifle that followed, every infantry doctrine that embraced distributed firepower, every tactical manual that recognized suppression as essential. Louis Chauchat had created something that endured not in arsenals, but in the understanding that sometimes being right too early meant carrying burdens that victory never fully relieved. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.